What is going on, everybody, and I hope you had a fantastic Saturday. This is MYG Jeffy T 3285, and I have some news that broke yesterday about the Brooklyn Nets signing David Duke Jr. to a two-way contract for this upcoming season, so he'll be able to participate in not only the G League, but for the Brooklyn Nets going into this season. Now, David Duke Jr. is pretty much a guy that was a spare player, a young undrafted rookie that came to the Nets last year and was able to win a roster spot, especially when there was injuries due to guys like Kyrie Irving, who was dealing with the vaccination stuff, as well as James Harden, Joe Harris, as well as Kevin Durant. So David Duke Jr., for the beginning of the season, had to pretty much be in there and be like that intangible type player, play hard defense, tough-nosed basketball, occasionally rebound by the basket. He's just a guy that has to go in there and do the dirty work. David Duke Jr. last year in 22 games, in 22 games last year, David Duke played about 16 minutes where he scored about 5 points per game with a field goal percentage of 36. He averaged 3 rebounds per game and 1 assist for the Brooklyn Nets in those 22 games last year. David Duke Jr. is going to be a guy that the Nets could pretty much, if they want to, because the amount of depth they have on this roster going into the season, they could stash him over in the G League for the beginning of the season, and then obviously they could sign him and bring him up to the the Nets roster if there's any type of injuries or if they think he's doing well enough in the G League, and they could bring him on to the main roster going forward. So this is a very good, solid addition for the Brooklyn Nets to be able to get a guy like David Duke Jr. locked up to that two-way deal. So because of the depth of the roster they have right now, they can always just stash him on that G League roster going forward. And then maybe if there's any type of injuries, the Nets can bring him back onto the roster going forward. So I'm actually very happy about it. The Nets did the same thing with a guy like Kessler Edwards. They signed him to a two-way deal because of the fact that the Nets have a lot of depth, like I mentioned, and David Duke Jr. has showed enough where he deserves an opportunity with this Nets roster. But the thing is, the team is so deep right now because of the players that they brought in, as well as some of the guys that are going to be returning from injury last year. The Nets are going to, maybe the best thing for the Nets is to allow a guy like David Duke Jr., who would probably get a limited amount of minutes anyway with this Brooklyn Nets roster, allow him go over to the G League for the beginning of the season, and then if he plays well enough, the Nets can bring him over to that main roster going forward. And I'd be very happy with that because I really like David Duke Jr. I think he's one of those gritty, tough, do-it-all type players. He'll occasionally hit you a three-point shot. He's not afraid to play hard-nosed defense in the middle of the court. He's not afraid as well to mix it up with some of the opposing players. He's also a guy that's not afraid to drive to the basket for those occasional shots. He's just one of those types of players that he's not going to put up your flashy stats. He's not going to go out there and light up the scoreboard or do anything like a superstar would. He's just a guy that's one of those glue guys type players. He's going to go out there and he's going to give you that nasty, hard-nosed type of play. And those are the types of guys that the Nets definitely could use more of. And I think if you allow a guy like David Duke Jr. to be able to come on the roster later on if they need him, I think he'd be a welcome addition. So I'm very happy that the Nets kept David Duke Jr. to a two-way deal, and now they have the option, if he finds a way to play well enough, to make this roster. If not, put him in the G League for a little bit, and then if he plays well enough, put him back on the Nets roster going forward. So that's just my breaking news I wanted to give you guys. As yesterday, the Brooklyn Nets officially signed David Duke Jr., shooting guard / small forward, to a two-way contract for this upcoming season for the Brooklyn Nets, as well as the G League Nets going forward. So if you guys like this video, please hit the like button below. Subscribe if you haven't already to NYG Jeffy T 85 for more breaking news, updates, and any type of chatter surrounding the Brooklyn Nets. Turn on the bell for notifications on the next video or short that will be dropping around the Brooklyn Nets. And let me know in the comment section what you think about the news of David Duke Jr. signing a two-way contract with the Brooklyn Nets, and if you think he could possibly make some sort of impact and carve out a role with this Brooklyn Nets roster going into the 2022-2023 season, even though this Nets team is going to have a lot more depth, like I said, with signings of guys like TJ Warren, Edmund Sumner, as well as Adonis Williams, and the fact there's going to be other players that are going into their second years, like Deron Sharp, Kessler Edwards, as well as Cam Thomas, plus you're getting back a guy like Joe Harris, as well as you're going to have Seth Curry there the entire season. And there's just going to be a lot more depth on this roster. Patty Mills will be back for a second year. So what do you guys let me know what you think in the comment section about a David Duke Jr., what he might bring to the table for the Nets. So everybody have a fantastic rest of your Saturday night. Take it easy, and we're just almost there for Brooklyn Nets training camp, and with the Brooklyn Nets NBA season will be starting very soon. So everybody have a great rest of your night. Take it easy, and let's go Brooklyn Nets. Everybody knows we live in a Nets world, representing that Barclays Center in Brooklyn.